So what happens when you remove the grill and protective cover from the back of a pair of high-end planar magnetic headphones and leave the driver and magnetic structure exposed? Well, that's what HiFiMan did with the Arya Unveiled headphones, and they've made some other changes compared to this pair of Stealth Magnet Aryas that I have here as well. Gone is the metal cups, and you now have plastic. Although the headband structure, of course, is still the same metal as before, the cups and the other components have switched to plastic, except, of course, the bar magnets. But there have been some other changes as well to the design. One of the things about the later versions of HiFiMan headphones is the stealth magnet structure, which they still are using in the Arya Unveiled. Now, inside this pair of Arya Stealths, you can probably just see the light shining through about a dozen bar magnets through to the driver, or maybe the light reflecting off the driver, rather. Now, they have this same structure on the front as well as the back. Of course, on the back, it's going to be harder to see because it's behind this grille. But with the new Arya Unveiled, they've gone for this shiny metal magnet structure. It's the same, as far as I can tell, as you get on the HE1000 Unveiled. But on the inside, you can see the bar magnets, they've removed about half of them. Now, we've seen before with other headphones, they might have a set of magnets on the front and back that's double-sided, or they might have a single-sided magnet structure, maybe just on the back. And that changes, of course, properties such as sensitivity and the like, or some headphones even come with an option of both, like the tungstens. But this is probably the first time we've seen headphones that have an unequal style of bar magnet structure on either side. But the primary thing is, with the sound quality, and this is what I believe HiFiMan were aiming for, is that when you use these headphones, even while you're playing back music, if you hold your hands out here, you'll hear the sound bouncing off your hands and affecting how the driver moves, because the diaphragm of the drivers are so incredibly light. And that means probably even sitting here and listening to music, there's probably some sound bouncing off the equipment next to me. Now, of course, that means anything close up to the driver, such as the grills in the back of these Arya Stealths, as well as that little protective cover in there, that's going to affect the sound as well. And removing them is something you often see DIYers do with various headphones. For example, hiding under my desk here, I have a pair of good old HD6XXs, or they're also known as HD650s, from Sennheiser. And one of the things you do, just ignore the weird bits of tape in there, is people pull these grills off and pull out the little bit of foam that's behind the drivers to improve the sound quality. And I can definitely say that pulling the grills off definitely does change the sound. And if it changes the sound in something, well, maybe as more old-fashioned as these regular dynamic driver headphones, you can imagine the effect that it has with a pair of higher-end planar magnetic headphones. It's quite significant. Now, in terms of other bits and pieces, they still use the same rather slightly stiff single-ended cable, or at least that's what they came with in the box. If you are into using a pair of aftermarket cables, and of course it's something I had to do to use the balanced equipment I have here, since they terminate on the headphone end with a 3.5mm plug, you can use headphone cables from a huge variety of manufacturers, both third-party or literally other pairs of headphones. I mean, I tend to very often use the Meze copper cables, and I'll leave a link to these in the description. They tend to be good soft cables. They look pretty if you care about that kind of thing. And I'm not going to get into sound quality and cables in this kind of review. I just don't think it's worth it. But I also have, if you look behind me, if you're very observant, it might the pair of Susvara Unveiled that are there. I have a pair of FiiO FT7 headphones, and I'm actually using the cable from those headphones on the Susvaras. So that's another one, although it's a kind of big and stiff cable. That actually says a lot about the quality of that cable that I'm using it on the Susvara Unveiled, but that's a whole other rabbit hole that I'm just not going to go down. Another rabbit hole I'm not going to go down too much is that HiFiMan are sponsoring my channel, and they're also sponsoring my CanJam show reports. Now, there's no discussion about what I say in my reviews, but my impression that HiFiMan wants is that they appreciate the fact that I'm just very straightforward with how I review gear. I'm certainly not here to sell anything, and I can say from experience that the ideal review just gives the most clear expression of how a product is, so that people who are interested in buying it get an idea of what they're going to get, as far as it's possible to do with a pair of headphones and talking about sound quality. Now, if the right customer is connected with the right product, then everyone wins. The customer gets the product they need, the reviewer gets some kind of payment, ideally, and then the manufacturer gets a customer that's happy. Everyone wins. So it's definitely not in my interest, not in the manufacturer's interest, and certainly not in your interest for me to try and sell you anything that you wouldn't like. And to that end, of course, if I do have affiliate links in the description, which I certainly do, they certainly don't give me anything if the customer returns the product. So it is totally not in my interest to actually ruin my reputation by trying to overhype or describe a product as being greater than it really is. But anyway, back onto the review itself. Now, given that of course, the magnet structure and driver is exposed, they do come with plastic protectors which have magnets built in, so they just snap on when you're not using the headphones. Obviously, you can't listen with them on as it completely wrecks the sound. But these headphones are the kind that you would not want to leave them on your desk around any, say, paper clips and the like, which might get in and damage the driver. Actually, the problem I tend to have in my house is I have a lot of jumpy spiders here, and they tend to like to build webs across little gaps such as this, so it's not uncommon for me to pull out a pair of headphones that have been sitting on the shelf back there and find little spider webs inside the cups. So I'm actually appreciate these protectors being there for that purpose. More importantly, you're probably going to be asking about now, well, come on Amos, get on with it, how do they sound? The answer is clearer, basically. Now, the Aryas have always been a fairly neutrally tuned pair of headphones. Now, neutral, yeah, there was an interesting comment in one of my videos about different reviewers describing things, what they meant by warm or neutral or whatever. By neutral to me, and this is something it's important to remember that everyone's ears are slightly different, even measurably, and there's a good video actually by Resolve showing how measuring the same pair of headphones on different people's heads actually results in considerable differences in how they perceive the mid-range and upper frequencies. However, down in the bass, our perception tends to be fairly even across everyone. Now, the traditional classic way of tuning headphones, which is what HiFiMan does, is fairly flat through from the low bass up to about 1 kilohertz. And then there's, of course, the hill in the frequency response to do with pinna gain. And then, of course, that tends to follow a pattern fairly similar across all kinds of headphones, with some, of course, maybe peaks and dips in there to do with maybe the headphone's resonances and compensating for that and other factors, which are probably too complex for this review and will probably go down too much of a rabbit hole. Old school neutral tend to be flat through to from the bass. To me, even before there was research into this, I tended to find that relative to what I would call neutral, a little bit mid-bass forward. Now, to me, I think a little bit mid-bass forward is actually a good thing because you want a little bit of slam in there. You don't want like pure neutral or pure flat if it were physically possible to do flat with everyone's ears, which requires individual tuning, but no. Would end up sounding, to me, a touch boring, at least with headphones, because you don't have quite that impact that you do with speakers. So to that end, that traditional dead flat through from the low bass tends to be good, although maybe it doesn't have quite as much low bass rumble as is ideal. Now, the other thing is modern research into how people perceive headphones tends to consider a fairly neutral sound signature to have more low bass than flat would express, and a touch of a drop through the mid bass as I described. And then there's a variation in what people perceived as being neutral compared to a pair of high-end speakers in a well-treated room, through the very low bass and through the mid-range. Now, I tend to find that the Harman curve, if that is considered neutral, is a little bit too forward in the mid-range for me. I prefer most of the time the sound that you get with, say, HiFiMan, Sennheiser, Focal, and the like, where there's a little bit of a drop relative to maybe technical neutral through about around the 2 kilohertz mark. I call it the 2 kilohertz suck out. Other people have names for it. And that's what HiFiMan has, and I tend to find that a good overall balance, relatively neutral, not excessive in any particular area, for listening to all kinds of music. Now, of course, how much you perceive brightness will vary between people. I find these about spot on for me. There's enough bass in there that it can slam when necessary, and there's a little bit of treble sparkle, which may be a little bit above technically neutral, but I tend to like that. And that tends to work very well with classical music. One of the other aspects, and I've talked about this in other reviews, is that I think HiFiMan does the best of emulating what a pair of electrostatic headphones sound like with a pair of planar magnetic headphones. Now, electrostats have a very light and airy sound. Some of that, of course, because to get slam out of electrostats requires very expensive amplifiers, which can push very, very high voltages. We're talking, 500 to 1,000 volts, very, very fast. And so that requires big money, especially since high voltage transistors tend not to exist anymore. They tend to use tubes now for that purpose. But to that end, if you don't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to get the results that electrostats can give, probably that the HiFiMans come closest to having that kind of light and airy sound while still delivering a good amount of slam, but also at the same time keeping everything fairly neutral so it works with many genres. So to that end, they're probably a touch on the brighter, lighter side versus technical neutral overall. but that made very good results for me, especially with classical and acoustic music of various kinds. I could hear fairly clearly where instruments were, even inside an orchestra, or I could hear the studio arrangement with something like Fink, for example, which is maybe more modern music, and there's still a degree of precision, and maybe they might be a touch bright for some people with modern rock. I listen to things like Spoon, for example, which can be very lively, and sometimes it may be a little bit too much, and there may be a touch too much sibilance. Maybe if there is a bit of sibilance in the music, that is going to be too much. With modern, very compressed pop, I probably wouldn't find them the most ideal because they might be too sharp sounding for preference, but I don't listen to a lot of compressed stuff nowadays. I think, but definitely acoustic music is where it's at with this kind of design. But compared to the original Arya Stealth magnet version, A being them, and I had them both plugged into the Cord TT2 behind me, I felt there was definitely a jump up in clarity going from the original Aryas to the Arya Stealth magnet version. It felt, well, literally like a veil had been lifted, and calling a pair of headphones veiled is something that goes back into Head-Fi tradition, back to those HD650s which I mentioned before. It did feel like there was a little bit more kind of a hazy sound in the mid-range of both the Arya Stealth magnets and the Arya Organic, where there was something kind of blocking the sound almost, as if there was a little bit of lack of clarity, like when you have a window which is slightly dirty. In the Arya Unveiled, the effect was felt like you'd cleaned your windows. Now that effect jumped up further, of course, with the HE1000 Unveiled, where there was even more clarity and the nuances of instruments were noticeably more distinct out of the TT2 and M scaler. Now, I wouldn't necessarily think that someone was going to pair a pair of $1,500 headphones with a close to $10,000 system with the Cord. And to that end, I did try them out of, say, the FiiO K17 I've reviewed recently, as well as HiFiMan's own Serenade. Now, one of the things I noticed mainly with the Arya Organics is that the headphones can sound a little bit left and right, and especially if you have a design that uses a modern Sigma Delta DAC but isn't the most resolving thing out there, such as the K17 up there, you may not get quite as much depth to the soundstage, and you tend to notice the width more. And that, the neutrality I found, and what some people call maybe just a touch warm, especially out of just the 6.3mm socket from the K17, it certainly worked very well with the Arya Unveiled, but they could definitely step up to something with a little bit more detail, such as, say, Schiit Audio's Mjolnir, which I have on my rack as well. An interesting observation I made when trying the various headphones with the HiFiMan Serenade is the Serenade gives a little bit more sense of depth to the music, while not quite as much width. And I think the lack of width versus, say, something like the FiiO, maybe because the headphone drive is possibly a little bit inferior. It was definitely a step down, of course, from the Mjolnir, using the Serenade as a DAC only. And that meant that, especially the Arya Organics, is that wider, shallower soundstage then became a little bit deeper, a little bit narrower, so it became more rounded overall, and that made for a nice synergistic match with the Arya Unveiled and the other Arya headphones. So the combination of a slightly brighter pair of headphones, which I consider the Aryas to be, at least to my ears, with a slightly softer sounding DAC and amp such as the Serenade, meant for a easy listening and enjoyable system. The other thing about unveiling the headphones is because you can hear more into the music, you can also hear more into the subtle differences between equipment. Less, like I said, between the slightly flatter and more neutral sounding K17 versus the more like deeper and slightly narrower sounding Serenade. If I plugged these into a tube amp, I got through some of the nice tube harmonics, which may be very pleasing as well. I could hear the very high clarity of the TT2 and M scaler setup as well. Everything came through with its own character, and that was one of the benefits of the Arya Unveiled, is that they will respond well to having at least a basically decently good system. I tend to say something at least like a Schiit Audio Jotunheim and a suitable DAC or something like that. Or like now, since I have not tried the latest Schiit Audio gear but do have the K17, at least something along those lines, if not the actual HiFiMan Serenade as well. And if you do get better gear later on, they will certainly jump up in terms of bringing through some of the resolution, if not as much as the almost double the price HiFiMan HE1000s. The only question remains, and this is one I can't answer, is how do these compare to the now heavily discounted HE1000 Stealth? And I think that's one of the mistakes HiFiMan has made, is that even after they release new models, they keep around the old models for a long time. Now, I think it's fine with, say, the Arya Stealths, but then the Arya Stealths become the question mark when you're looking at, say, the Anandas or other models which are under $1,000. But considering that the Arya Stealths were around the $1,500 mark, and now we have the Arya Unveiled around the $1,500 mark, that are, to my ears, a noticeable sonic improvement, at least we know that the sound quality available for your money is increasing, and especially with inflation, increasing even more than we perceive. Finally, thank you to all my patrons and caffeinators. If you'd like to become a monthly supporter, you can ask me questions about these, and you can also talk to me direct and influence what I review. Also, thanks to HiFiMan for sending me the headphones as well as sponsoring my channel. Now, lastly, before you go, do you have a pair of Arya Unveiled? And if so, how about leave your impressions in the comments below? I aim to make these reviews useful, and if people watching them also get feedback from people who actually own the product and use it daily, that will also make this review more useful in turn. So thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in person at CanJam.